Mark Davis had always prided himself on his work ethic. For over 2 decades, he poured his heart and soul into the local factory that served as the lifeblood of his small town. The clang of machinery and the hum of productivity were familiar sounds that marked his daily life. Mark worked long shifts, often sacrificing holidays and weekends, believing that his dedication would secure a stable future for his family. To him, the factory wasn't just a job. It was a symbol of pride, purpose, and perseverance. But that sense of security shattered when he was called into his supervisor's office one fateful afternoon. The words, budget cuts and downsizing, felt like a gut punch. Mark, along with dozens of others, was laid off without much notice. The factory, now under new management, had decided to bring in a cheaper workforce to save costs. To Mark's dismay, many of these new hires were Mexican immigrants who had recently moved to the area. Mark couldn't hide his frustration as he packed up his belongings and walked out of the factory for the last time. He had worked tirelessly to provide for his wife, Lisa, and their teenage daughter, Emily, only to feel discarded and replaced. As weeks turned into months, Mark's bitterness grew. Every time he drove past the factory, he saw unfamiliar faces, faces he blamed for taking the job he had worked so hard to keep.
One morning, Mark was sitting in his car outside the factory gates, his eyes fixed on the workers entering the building. That's when he spotted Carlos, a young Mexican man wearing the same uniform Mark had worn for years. A wave of anger washed over him. To Mark, Carlos represented everything that had gone wrong. His fists tightened around the steering wheel as thoughts raced through his mind. Why should someone like him get the job I gave my life to? Unable to contain his frustration, Mark stepped out of his car and confronted Carlos in the parking lot. His accusations were sharp and direct, fueled by resentment and a sense of injustice. Carlos, caught off guard, tried to explain that he was simply working to support his family, but Mark wasn't ready to listen. Their heated exchange drew the attention of nearby workers, setting the stage for a deeper conversation about responsibility, fairness, and the real root of the issue. This moment, born of anger and misunderstanding, would be the start of an unexpected journey, one that would challenge Mark's assumptions, reveal Carlos's own struggles, and transform how both men viewed each other in a world of shared hardships. As the tension in the parking lot grew, Carlos stood his ground, though his voice remained calm. "Look, man," he said, his Spanish accent noticeable but clear. "I'm just trying to make a living. My family depends on me, same as yours does for you." Mark's jaw tightened. He wanted to yell, to vent all the anger building up inside him, but something in Carlos's tone held him back. Instead, Mark grumbled, "You think that makes it okay? Guys like you come in, take the jobs, and the rest of us get thrown out like trash. I worked here for over 20 years. What about my family?" Carlos opened his mouth to respond, but paused. Instead of arguing, he looked Mark in the eye. "I'm sorry for what you're going through," he said, his voice sincere. "I didn't take your job. The people running this place did." The words lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken truths hanging between them. Mark didn't have a response. Deep down, he knew Carlos wasn't the one who signed off on the layoffs, but that didn't make the sting of losing his livelihood any less painful. Instead of continuing the argument, Mark muttered under his breath and walked back to his car. For the rest of the day, Carlos's words replayed in Mark's mind. He hated how they unsettled him. Was it really the management's fault? Had he unfairly taken out his frustration on Carlos? Mark shook the thought away, choosing to focus instead on how much his family was struggling without his steady income. The weeks dragged on, and Mark found himself at the local food pantry for the first time in years. The line was long, filled with people who looked just as worn out and defeated as he felt. As he waited, he spotted a familiar figure ahead of him, Carlos. Carlos was with a woman, presumably his wife, and 2 young children. They were speaking in hushed Spanish, their voices soft but hurried. Mark observed the family from a distance, noting the worn-out shoes the children wore and the tired look on Carlos's face. A pang of guilt hit him unexpectedly. Carlos wasn't living some dream life while Mark struggled. He was struggling too. When Carlos turned and spotted Mark, he hesitated. Their eyes met, and for a moment, both men seemed unsure of how to react. But instead of walking away, Carlos nodded politely, acknowledging Mark without hostility. Mark gave a stiff nod in return, unsure of what else to do. As they each received their bags of food, fate seemed to intervene again. The pantry's volunteer mistakenly handed Carlos a bag that was too small for his family. Mark, still holding his own bag, caught the error and spoke up. "Hey, that one's not right for him," he said, surprising himself. Carlos turned, his eyebrows raised in surprise as the volunteer corrected the mistake. "Thanks," Carlos said quietly. Mark shrugged. "No problem." A few days later, Mark found himself sitting at the kitchen table with Lisa and Emily. The two were trying to lift his spirits, but it was clear the stress of his unemployment was taking a toll on everyone. Emily, always outspoken, decided to challenge him. "Dad, you can't keep blaming those guys for what happened at the factory," she said, setting her fork down with a determined look. Mark frowned. "What do you mean? Of course I can. They wouldn't need to hire outside workers if things hadn't changed." Emily shook her head. "No, Dad, it's the factory owners. They're the ones who cut corners and made those decisions. Carlos didn't walk in and steal your job. He probably had no choice but to take what he could find." Lisa, always the peacemaker, chimed in. "She has a point, Mark. Maybe you're misplacing your anger. The layoffs hurt everyone, not just you." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He hated how his family was siding with logic over the raw pain he felt. But their words, combined with Carlos's calm demeanor and the sight of his family at the pantry, planted a seed of doubt in his mind. The final turning point came at a town hall meeting held to address the factory layoffs. Mark attended reluctantly, still feeling angry, but curious about what would be said. The room was packed, filled with displaced workers, community members, and a handful of the new hires. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he stood up, his voice shaky with emotion. "I've worked at that factory for over 20 years. I gave my life to that place, and they threw me out like I didn't matter. And now?" He hesitated, his gaze landing on Carlos, who was seated a few rows away. "Now, I see people like him working there, and it's hard not to feel like they took something from me. But I realize that's not fair." The room fell silent. Carlos shifted in his seat but didn't look away.
Mark continued. "The real issue isn't the workers. It's the people at the top, the ones who see us all as numbers, not as human beings. They don't care about loyalty, hard work, or fairness. They care about saving a buck, even if it tears our community apart." The crowd murmured in agreement, and a wave of relief washed over Mark as he realized he wasn't alone in his frustration. Carlos raised his hand and stood up. "I want to say something," he said, his voice steady. "I understand why people are angry. My family and I came here because we didn't have a choice. We left behind everything to escape violence and poverty. I know some of you look at me and see someone who doesn't belong, but I'm just trying to survive, like all of you."
He glanced at Mark. And he's right. The problem isn't us fighting each other. It's the system that keeps us divided. The room erupted in applause. For the first time, Mark saw Carlos not as an enemy, but as someone who shared his struggles and pain. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Mark and Carlos began to talk. It started small, a polite nod at the grocery store, a brief exchange about the town hall meeting. But as time went on, their conversations grew deeper. Carlos shared more about his life in Mexico, the danger his family faced, and the hope that brought them to the United States. Mark, in turn, opened up about his decades at the factory, his struggles to provide for his family, and the pride he felt in his work. One day, Carlos invited Mark to his home for dinner. Mark hesitated, but accepted. As he sat at the modest dining table, surrounded by Carlos's family, he couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity. The laughter of children, the smell of home-cooked food. It reminded him of his own family's dinners, back when life felt stable and secure. As the night went on, Mark realized something profound. Despite their different backgrounds, he and Carlos were more alike than he'd ever imagined. Both men wanted the same thing, a chance to provide for their families and live with dignity. Mark began to channel his frustration into something constructive. Inspired by the town hall meeting, he and Carlos joined forces with other workers to push for better labor practices in the factory. They organized rallies, wrote letters to local representatives, and raised awareness about the need for fair wages and job security. For Mark, it wasn't just about fighting for his old job anymore. It was about ensuring that no one, whether a longtime resident like him or a newcomer like Carlos, had to face the same struggles in silence. The sun was setting over the town as Mark Davis found himself standing at the gates of the factory he had called home for over 20 years. This time, he wasn't there to look back in anger or to dwell on what he had lost. Instead, he stood there alongside Carlos and a crowd of workers, both longtime employees and recent hires, holding signs and chanting for change. Their voices echoed in unison, demanding fair wages, improved working conditions, and an end to exploitative practices. What had begun as a confrontation in a parking lot had grown into a movement, one that united workers from all walks of life. For Mark, the transformation was both personal and profound. The power of unity. The journey to that moment wasn't easy. There were days when Mark doubted whether their efforts would make a difference. He and Carlos had faced pushback from some in the community who clung to old prejudices, unwilling to see past their differences. Even some workers were hesitant to join the fight, fearful of losing their already precarious jobs. But Mark and Carlos kept pushing forward. They attended community meetings, spoke at local events, and even reached out to labor rights organizations for support. Mark, once hesitant to speak publicly, found his voice. He shared his story with passion, recounting his decades of loyalty to the factory and the heartbreak of being discarded. Carlos, with his calm yet determined demeanor, spoke about the sacrifices his family had made to build a better life and the dignity all workers deserved. Together, they became a symbol of what was possible when people set aside their differences and fought for a common cause. A shift in perspective. Mark's transformation wasn't just about joining a cause, it was about fundamentally rethinking how he saw the world. His friendship with Carlos had opened his eyes to the struggles immigrants faced, not just in finding work, but in gaining acceptance. One day, as they were preparing materials for a rally, Carlos shared more about his life in Mexico. "I didn't want to leave," he admitted. "I loved my home. But when the violence got worse and I couldn't keep my family safe, I had no choice. Coming here was a risk, but it was the only way to give my kids a chance at something better." Mark listened intently, realizing just how much Carlos had sacrificed. "I guess I never thought about what it takes to start over in a new place," Mark said. "I've lived here my whole life. Everything I've ever known is right here. But you left everything behind." Carlos nodded. "It's not easy, but when you're a parent, you'll do anything for your kids. I see that in you too, Mark. You've worked so hard for your family. That's why I know we're not so different." That conversation stuck with Mark. It was a reminder that Carlos wasn't just a face in the crowd. He was a father, a husband, and a man doing his best to survive. Small wins, big changes. Their efforts began to pay off in small but meaningful ways. Local newspapers started covering the rallies, highlighting the workers' demands and shedding light on the factory's exploitative practices. The community, once divided, began to rally behind them. Churches, small businesses, and even schools got involved, hosting fundraisers and spreading awareness. The factory's management, initially dismissive of the workers' efforts, began to feel the pressure. After weeks of organizing, the company finally agreed to meet with representatives from the workers' group. Mark and Carlos were among those chosen to speak on behalf of their peers. At the meeting, Mark felt a mix of nerves and determination. He looked around the room at the polished executives who had made the decision to lay off workers like him. For a moment, he felt small, but then he remembered why he was there. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable," Mark said firmly. "We're asking for respect, for fair wages and decent treatment. We've given our lives to this factory. All we want is the chance to support our families without being cast aside." Carlos followed, speaking about the challenges faced by immigrant workers who often felt invisible. "We're not just numbers on a spreadsheet," he said. "We're people just like you, and all we want is to work hard and be treated fairly." The executives listened, some visibly uncomfortable, but the workers' unity was undeniable, a new beginning. Weeks later, the factory announced changes. While it wasn't a complete victory, there were significant improvements: increased wages, better safety protocols, and a commitment to hiring practices that valued both longtime employees and new workers equally. For Mark, it felt like a step in the right direction, not just for the factory, but for the community as a whole. Mark had also found a new sense of purpose. Though he didn't return to his old job, he became a leading advocate for workers' rights, helping others navigate the challenges of layoffs and advocating for systemic change. Carlos, too, became a trusted voice in the community, helping other immigrant families integrate and find stability. A moment of reflection. One evening, Mark invited Carlos and his family over for dinner. It was a simple meal, spaghetti and garlic bread, but the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. As their children played in the backyard, Mark and Carlos sat on the porch, sipping coffee and reflecting on how far they'd come. "You know," Mark said, "if you'd told me 6 months ago that I'd be sitting here with you, I wouldn't have believed it." Carlos chuckled. "Me neither, but I'm glad we're here." Mark nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "You've taught me a lot, Carlos, about resilience, about family, about seeing people for who they really are, not who you think they are." "And you've taught me that change is possible," Carlos replied, "even when it feels impossible." Looking ahead. As the night wore on, Mark thought about the future. He knew there were still challenges ahead. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight, and the fight for fair labor practices was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The town was slowly healing, its people coming together in ways he hadn't seen before. Mark was proud to be part of that change, proud to have stood up not just for himself, but for others who had been overlooked and undervalued. And as he watched Carlos's children laugh and play alongside Emily, he realized something profound. The future wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about building something better, together. This moment of reflection marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For Mark, Carlos, and the community, it was a reminder that even in the face of hardship, unity and compassion could create lasting change. And that, they all agreed, was something worth fighting for.